Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm always so enamored by how many of you continue to come out whenever we have folks join us when it comes to grant funds, but then just to share what's going on out in the world and in our partners world. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to both Leslie and Nikki of the National Trust. They have received an award from NEH for telling the full history. They have to hurry up and get rid of this money. And I mean, like, as right now, it's on the website. The portal opened on the 1st, correct? November 1st. And it's going to close December 15th, correct? They're going to tell you more. I don't want to bore you, but when I say that this money has to go quickly, it has to go quickly. So that means that your applications have to be in like yesterday. And not to scare anyone, but yesterday. Also, I can say that the trust portal, please do not be intimidated by it. It is nothing like grants.gov. They have really thought about how to make sure when you're applying for grants, that it's just as easy peasy as possible. So you'll be able to get in and get out really quickly. Camille, next slide. So for those of you who are new to AAAM, or those of you who just want to hear about Camille and I a little bit more, we are the Association of African American Museums, and we're a nonprofit member organization established to support African and African American focused museums nationally and internationally. As of today, our membership has grown 193%. So thank you so much since our Mellon grant in 2018. I want to introduce you to Camille really quickly. Camille is our special projects intern. She's been with us since, I'm just going to say 2020, Camille. Hey. But it feels longer than that. So that's why I stumbled on that one. But Camille has just been a huge asset to our office. Right now, she's working on her PhD at Howard. So if you have any questions about Howard and PhD processes, please contact Camille because she has all the goods. Not me, Camille. Camille, next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping items, please. For the purposes of this session, make sure that your phones or your microphones are on mute. Also, feel free to drop your name and your institution into the chat so we know who's here today with us. And towards the end, we're going to have questions and comments. And at that point, you can bombard Nikki and Leslie with all of your burning questions. They will take them. But without further ado, I will pass it on to Nikki and Leslie. Camille, next slide. Thank you.
If I could have the next slide, please. Hi, I'm Leslie Kanan with the National Trust Preservation Services and Outreach Department, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Nikki Van, to tell you about the exciting new grant program made possible through the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please. This program is focused on providing grants to communities that are often underrepresented in the places and stories that we highlight and preserve in historic preservation. We are further focusing on those underrepresented communities that have been negatively impacted by COVID, and on those underrepresented communities and some of the underrepresented communities that we will be working with include, but are not limited to, Black Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, the indigenous communities, LGBTQA community, women, immigrants, and others. Through this program, we will award 60 to 80 grants in a single round. The grants will range from $25,000 to $50,000 and will be awarded in the following 4 categories. Next slide, please. Those categories include research, planning, and implementation of interpretation programs, research and documentation for local, state, and federal designations, architectural design and planning to preserve and activate historic places, and training workshops to support interpretation and preservation of historic places. I would note that when we are talking about place, we are looking at the broadest definition to go beyond single buildings or sites. I will now turn it over to Nikki to discuss more nuts and bolts of the program.
Thanks for that overview, Leslie. I've seen some of you all introducing yourselves in the chat, and I see some past National Trust grantees, so that's wonderful, and some who I think we've spoken with in the past, so I'm glad you're all here today. So Leslie gave a broad overview of the program. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts, the more boring pieces. There are a few basic eligibility requirements that all applicants must meet before applying. Eligible applicants are listed here, and they include 501c3 nonprofit organizations, accredited colleges or universities, state or local government agencies, or tribal governments and TIPOs. This funding, as Vidette mentioned, is part of the American Rescue Plan, and applicants will be required to demonstrate how their entity was adversely impacted by the pandemic. Additionally, since this funding is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, applicants will need to either be humanities-based organizations, which I believe all of you are, or will need to demonstrate a history of past humanities-based work. Note that for this program, for our purposes, historic preservation is considered humanities-based work. Finally, if the potential applicant or if their parent organization received funding directly from the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan Humanities Organization Program, they'll be considered ineligible for funding from our program, from the Telling the Full History Grant Program. We link to a list of organizations who received that funding on our site, and we're happy to answer any questions, individual questions about eligibility, because it's a little bit confusing on our end as well, that piece of it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Leslie provided an overview of the type of projects we're looking to fund through this program, and here are some examples of the actual expenses that can be covered with this grant. As funds are intended to support organizations during the pandemic, supporting existing staff or hiring new staff are allowable expenses. Other expenses can include consulting costs, training costs, design and implementation costs, and material and media costs. The things that are listed here aren't comprehensive. There are other costs that can be included in your budget. So again, with any questions that you may have, grant staff will be available to help guide you through that process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the National Trust, in selecting our final slate of grantees, the 60 to 80 that Leslie mentioned, we will be relying on an independent external selection committee for recommendation on the final grantees. That committee will consider a number of factors when reading applications, including how the project will engage the community, the strength of the organization, and the feasibility of the project, its timeline and budget. Applications will also be judged against the degree to which they will fit into the NEH's More Perfect Union project. Additional details on that last bullet can be found in our grant guidelines. It's an ongoing initiative of the NEH. Next slide, please. So here are some important dates to keep in mind. The most immediate is the application due date, which again, Vidette mentioned is approaching quickly. It's Wednesday, December 15th, 2021 at 11:59 p.m. applicants local time. So the deadline, the application opened November 1st. We've been open for a few weeks. We've had one person submit so far, so it is doable to turn it around quickly. All projects must be complete by that date, and the timeline you submit, the other important date to keep in mind is the March 31st date listed there. That is when all projects must be complete. And when you submit an application, you'll be asked to include a timeline. the application in the timeline in your application should have an end date on or before March 31st. And that's going to be a pretty hard deadline. That is a requirement of the National Endowment of the Humanities and their funding. Next slide, please. So finally, this is a link to more information about the program. If you go to this page, I believe that Camille is going to drop this link into the chat box. This is where you can find our full grant guidelines. You can find a link to some frequently asked questions. You can find a few videos that go over both how you access our application system, but also essentially the same spiel that Leslie and I just gave here. And you can also find the link to the application itself. Since the grant comes from federal funds, we understand this application is going to be a little more difficult than some are used to. It's a little more difficult than our standard preservation fund application form. So if you're familiar with that, just know that there are more questions on this form than you may have seen in the past. And since there are some strict eligibility requirements, we've crafted an eligibility quiz prior to being able to access the application to help weed out people who would ultimately be deemed ineligible. We don't want people to spend their time applying for something that they will not be receiving. So when you go to that site, if you take the eligibility quiz, if for some reason you're told you're ineligible and you feel that's an error, you can always reach out to us. We can talk you through it. It may be that you just mistakenly answered a question and we can help you get access to the application. But if you have any questions in general after reviewing these materials, please feel free to reach out to us. I saw that there was a question about the timeline. Let me just open the chat for a second here. So the March 31st date. No, so if you go back to the timeline, Camille, the previous slide, final reports are going to be due from grantees by July 29th. So all reporting will be due, what is that, April, May, June, 4 months after the project complete date. Let's see, can the grant include expenses for a fiscal agent or media assistant for the interpretive program? We are not allowing fiscal agents for this specific grant program. We do for many of our other grant programs, but due to auditing requirements of NEH and the federal grant itself, we are only providing grants directly to the organizations who will be implementing the work. And then the media assistant, if I might need to talk to you more about that, but if it's hiring a consultant or bringing on a new staffer, those are things that you can apply for. But do you want me to just kind of go through these questions and answer them as
Sure.
as I see them,
Sure.
or?
I was going to start throwing them out to you, but
Okay. Feel free.
No,
I was seeing them pop up as I was talking.
Yeah,
so.
no, you're fine. You're fine because they're relevant to the slides so that we won't have to circle back around. You're fine. No problem.
Okay. Okay.
Nikki, if I could follow up on one of the questions, or maybe
Please.
Or if you could provide clarification on the fiscal agent. While we're not allowing fiscal agent, is it correct in saying that if an organization wanted to collaborate with an organization, they could do that? So you can't have a fiscal agent, but you can collaborate. And if it was a true collaboration and not just a pass-through, that you could do that. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, let me give you an example. So we were talking to an applicant who had received that NEH funding that would make them ineligible for this specific program. They're working with a partner organization in their city. And so in that case, we suggested to them that the partner organization, who themselves are an independent 501c3, that they apply and be the potential grantee in this case. And then those two organizations will work together to make the project happen. It depends on I think that like in that case, it would work well because all of the program costs that they were considering were external costs. They weren't necessarily to support staff. So it may depend on what you're looking to do with the program, but we, again, are happy to, any special cases like that, our team is happy to talk that through with you and try to figure out a solution. see, but do you want to throw the questions our way at this point?
Sure. Keith wanted to know what total numbers of grants are expected.
Okay. Yeah, so we are anticipating giving somewhere between 60 to 80 grants, and grants will be made in the amounts of either 25,000 or 50,000. So that 60 to 80 is a range because we're not sure exactly how the money is going to ultimately break out. We'll have to see how the requests come in.
Okay. Reagan wants to know, can the grant include the purchase of archival supplies or collection shelving?
Good question. So collections, give me 1 sec. Can we come back to that question in 1 second while I look at the wording in our guidelines? Thank you. Feel free to throw another one out while we.
Okay.
There was a question further up about whether you had to be a paid member of the trust, and I believe you don't.
Do not. No, and this program is also different from some of our other grant funding programs in that it does not require a match. So you can ask for 100% of your project costs through this program.
Paulie's asking, can you imagine a project that includes commissioning a writer or history-based performing artist to develop a program? I'm assuming that, Paulie, are you saying because of the interpretation standpoint?
Okay.
Or are you?
So this grant opportunity can pay for interpretation for projects that relate to interpretation, to the creation of interpretive materials. It cannot pay for the creation of art or performance art. So without, we might need to, it is strictly humanities. It is not NEA funding, it's NEH funding. So they've made that clear line. But again, if you have a specific project you want to talk through, we're happy to talk about details with you. To go back to the collections question, this fund cannot support collections acquisition. That is an NEH guideline that they asked us to pass on. The other materials related to that, we allow for the project can fund 20% of your budget can be for equipment costs. So I think it would, how competitive an application might be that has those costs in that, I don't know. We'd have to see. But I don't think on their face they are ineligible costs. I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Let's see. Paulie, do you mind taking yourself off of mute and asking your question directly?
Sure, I think it was answered actually, whoops.
Okay.
About the idea of how strictly we're sticking in the humanities lane. So for example, we have a person who's a dancer and performing artist who creates these amazing walking tours that are interpretive. They incorporate a tremendous amount of historical research, but they wouldn't necessarily be somebody with, say, an advanced degree in history. And I know sometimes humanities grants are really specific about people with humanities credentials and that kind of thing. So it's just trying to see how much space there is in that kind of arena.
Yeah. And Leslie, I don't know if you want to chime in here, but from that very brief description, it doesn't sound as though they are a dancer, but they're not creating art. They're talking about the history and the interpretation. And based on what you told me, I think that would be an eligible program. So, or eligible project. The NEH has given the National Trust this funding to disseminate based on the guidelines and the program that we put forth, and we did not have strict language about the credentials of the people who will be developing these materials. Leslie, do you want to talk to that more?
Yeah, well, and it specifically reminds me of the idea of, in some communities, the idea of who has the right to tell a story and
Right.
who has credentials and what is eligible and not eligible. And so the idea of someone who does these amazing walking tours and does this amazing storytelling but doesn't have a PhD is perhaps the exact type of person that we're looking for. And we certainly don't want to discourage people because they don't supposedly have the right credentials. And to Nikki's earlier point, as long as it's not a dance performance, which might be wonderful, but just doesn't fit under this particular grant, we're not going to be looking at credentials. We're just going to be looking at that they're producing something that falls within the humanities realm.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you were able to get the funding to be that flexible and really honor the people whose credentials don't necessarily include letters.
Mhm.
Great, thank you so much. Michelle, if you are in a position to take yourself off of mute and ask your question about your eligibility since you just received a grant, be great. Michelle Banks. Maybe she's not in a position to take herself off of mute, but Michelle wants to know if they're eligible because they just received a California Humanities grant, and that funding was also through the American Rescue Plan Act.
Okay, let me.
But it came through
That-
the state,
yeah,
right? It came through the state as opposed to directly from NEH?
Yeah, it
Yes.
sounds, I mean, I believe they would be eligible, but Michelle, if you could send an email to the telling the full history at savingplaces.org email address, just with a little more information about the grant you received, we can confirm that is the case, that you would be eligible.
Okay. Thank you. Terrence, would you mind taking yourself off mute so you can ask your question and everybody can hear your baritone?
And it's so tenor.
I know.
That was so fun. Yeah, I was regarding the categories. Are we able to, our proposal able to cover more than one of the categories that was described, the 4 categories? And I think Dr. Keith had the same question and wanted more further clarity on that.
Mhm.
The categories. Thank you.
So short answer is yes, you can, your project can blend those categories together. In terms of the categories themselves, Leslie, would you mind addressing that question a little more in depth from a programmatic side of things?
Yeah, sure. So part of what will happen, and this happens often with projects where you'll submit under one particular category, and we might think it's a better fit for another, and that's perfectly fine. But I also think that what happens is we also see this happen where what you're proposing sort of fits under little pieces of each one. And we can sort of figure out that as well. So I think as long as what you're proposing sort of fits generally under pieces of one of these categories, that you'll be fine. And what you might want to do as you figure out what you want to do is email us and say, hey, this is what I want to do. And then we can take a closer look at the categories and sort of make sure that what you're doing at least fits under pieces of one of the categories.
Okay. Terrence, does that help? Okay. Keith, do you mind taking yourself off mute to speak about the arts organization that you have a question about in a little bit more detail?
Well, what I would like to know more about are the 4 categories. I understand that slide went by really quickly. There was like an architecture, and there were that's the one I saw. So again, I'm trying to understand what the categories are And I also needed just a little bit more clarity on whether or not you can apply for each of the categories, or is it one grant application per organization?
Yeah, so I can answer that.
And let me just get the other one out
Mhm.
too. And if you're an arts organization, can you apply but have a humanities project, or is it's just for humanities organizations?
I can answer those. Well, first, Camille, would it be possible to get that slide back up on screen? That'd be great. To answer your last two questions, we are limiting applications to one application per organization. So we're asking you to put your best foot forward and prioritize, apply for what you feel is the highest priority for your organization. Arts organizations can apply if they can demonstrate that a past history of doing humanities-based work or projects, and as long as this project relates to the humanities. So arts organizations on their face are not ineligible organizations. And then again, Leslie had asked if you could walk through a little more detail about these 4 categories and maybe some ideas of what might fall under them.
Sure, so I'm pasting them into the chat. But so let's start with the first one, which is research, planning, and implementation of public interpretive programs that utilize diverse places and tell the history of the United States and Indigenous peoples. So essentially, it's about interpretation. So if you have a place, a space, a site, a story that you want to tell, how do you go about doing the research for that? How do you go about implementing that? So that could look like a lot of things. That could look like hiring somebody to do the research to do it. It could look like hiring somebody to do the planning for it. Or if you already have an idea of what you want to do, it could look like doing the implementation of that plan. It could look like a guidebook. It could look like an actual, what I believe it was Pomeroy perhaps that was on earlier that was talking about an actual walking tour of some sort. People have asked us about doing documentaries. People have asked us about doing guidebooks or displays, but some people are earlier in the process and have asked us about, we need to do research and oral histories and things of that nature to actually get the story told. So in that category, we might be looking at something like that. Then the second category is research and documentation to enable local, state, and federal landmark designations to recognize historic places of importance to underrepresented communities. So there are all sorts of designations, whether that is local historic districts, local historic buildings or sites, whether this is national landmarks, whatever sort of local, city, county, state, federal designations that you might be interested in your area. You might get funds to allow you to do the research or to do the actual process of getting those sites, buildings, areas designated in any of those types of categories. Then you have architectural design and planning to advance preservation and activation of historic buildings and landscapes that tell the full history of the United States and Indigenous people. So this gets into actually doing some design work and planning around an actual building to either preserve it or figure out how to reuse it, or, and that could look like hiring an architect to actually do some planning or figure out how to activate it, or but also all around telling the story of the building, because in all these situations we want to figure out how to highlight the story of the buildings. And the last one is implementation of training workshops to support underrepresented groups in preserving and/or interpreting historic places. And this is an interesting one because one of the things that someone asked us early on was about whether they're looking at a building and they said, well, could we invite someone to do a window workshop and sort of teach people in the community how to repair historic windows while we're also working on this building. So looking at doing whether they're workshops on how to repair buildings, whether they're workshops on how to designate buildings, workshops on how to do oral histories. There are all sorts of workshops that you could do. I'm mentioning historic preservation examples because I'm a historic preservationist, but there are all sorts of humanities based workshops. You know, some of you work at museums, or there are different types of trainings around museums or archives or different things that are related to humanities that would be a benefit to people in underrepresented communities. One of the questions that we got today had to do with communities that are in lower socioeconomic categories that are, and that's a whole another demographic that some of you might be related to those, be related to those communities that we can also reach out to. So anyway, so workshops and trainings, again, to tell the story and figure out how to make that happen. So does that make sense in terms of what you might be able to apply for?
Yeah, it does.
And Leslie, just to build off a point you just made about the question we got today about different underrepresented communities and how we define that. Another example we got a question about from somebody who was interpreting a mental institution and wanted to ask us if we considered those who struggle with mental health issues as an underrepresented community whose story is not told in current narratives. And yes, we do. And so while we gave examples of some underrepresented communities that would fall under this program, there are a host of examples that we either wouldn't have thought of before being asked the question, or they're just too numerous to list. So please be free in your thinking of how to define what an underrepresented community is. And again, if you have any question, always feel free to reach out to us and ask.
Thanks. Rand, do you mind taking yourself off mute real quick and see that you have a question as well?
Yeah, thank you with that. Hi, everyone. I'm off the camera. My question is, does exhibitions fall under the public interpretive programs?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think where you kind of have to thread the needle on that one, there is a 20% cap on equipment costs. So for your budget, so if you are manufacturing the exhibits, there may be a cap on how much you can apply for that specific expense. So NEH has given us the guidance that anything that costs $5,000 or less is considered a supply and not equipment. So depending on how you break down your budget and write things up, there's, be creative.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Joanne, are you in a position to take yourself off mute? If not, I'll read your question. I know the answer, but I think that it's best that you hear it directly from Leslie and Nikki.
Yeah. I put myself off mute. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. My question was, if you have a full story around a building or a site that's of historic significance, but it has not been nominated as a historic site, will that building be eligible, to tell the story around, whereas the history is very significant?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, one of the categories actually allows you to nominate buildings and sites, but we're really relying on the community to let us know, what's significant, because but it doesn't need, the short answer is it doesn't have to be designated to be significant. It just has to be significant by the community standards.
Thank you all so much. Oh, excuse me.
Sure. Another thing that Vidette and I talked about leading up to this call, we also, the building itself or the site itself, the history and its importance to the underrepresented community being talked about, it can be a recent history. It can be, it could be a building that was originally designed as, a Carnegie library that is now a homeless shelter, or that's serving an underrepresented group. So there are, it doesn't have to be that this building was built for this community, has always been used by this community. We again are being fairly broad in how we view this.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Joanne. Anne, are you in a position to take your phone off mute?
Yes, I am.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question because we have identified 55 locations on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean, U.S. territories that Africans first arrived after the Middle Passage. And we are trying to raise funding for the markers and the ancestral remembrance ceremonies. So far, we've accomplished that in 30 locations. So we've got 22 still to do. Would the work that we do with the various communities to make this happen, we have to do text, we review them for accuracy. There are lots of moving components in preparation. Would we qualify in terms of either staffing or publication materials to promote the history? And the sites are not specific. We are talking about what are former commercial docks where Africans arrived in each of these locations. So the work is extensive. The research has been done, but it's the work of organizing and then having the interpretation. So I just want to know, when you said landmark, do markers qualify for that?
So
I would-
yeah.
Yeah, I would think my real question, because I think that the research would definitely, like, I don't have a concern with it not being a specific location, and I don't have a concern about the research. My question is about it being in multiple locations, in multiple, like, because it's in multiple communities as opposed to a single community.
Right.
So we might have to take that back to the group, because to me it's research. The general area, like you know generally where the dock is,
right,
in each of these places. So that's not the real issue. The real issue is that you're talking about multiple states, and sometimes, that's my main question.
Yeah, because I mean, our work is coordinating and organizing with these communities so that if we could be funded as the, I don't almost want to say the mother project, would that qualify? I mean, the end product would be the markers and the ceremonies, but there's work that our project does to enable that. And I'm asking, would we qualify? I mean, should we pursue this grant?
Yeah.
And I think that you should pursue the grant. I think you need to narrow down which area you want to apply for.
Okay.
And then unfortunately, you'll probably have to apply to several other programs and piecemeal it. So
Yeah, I mean,
you know, and I can definitely help you find, you know, this is a trust program today, but there are other organizations that we work with that do allow for funding for markers. And but they'll also want you to do it state by state and locale by locale. So it sounds like you have a very comprehensive list of where everything is. So even if you have to get a grant each year to do a ceremony each year, I think that would, I mean, it's cumbersome, but I think that, you know, if you're going after funding like this, you know, you would probably have to do it that way.
okay, but I mean, should we pursue this grant is my question.
No, I guess my thing is you should definitely pursue it. I just don't know if we could do it for all the sites, because
Right.
the way that it is there for individual communities. And so we haven't had ones where we're sort of looking at multiple ones, which is why I was going to sort of go back to our group and sort of, you know, us have a discussion about it. But I definitely think you should pursue it. But to Ms. Robinson's point, we may not be able to, you know, fund for the entire thing. It may be, we may ask you to narrow down the scope.
Yeah, and we may be only talking about publication materials that then we could, you know, provide to the locations. I mean, I understand. I'm just wondering, do we qualify? I guess is my question. Yeah.
Yes, I do
So that
think
if it's for materials or even a staff person to coordinate,
Yeah.
you do
that's
qualify.
sort of what I would use this grant for.
Yeah.
And I would
Not
be
for the
clear-
markers, not for the markers.
Okay.
I would be clear in your narrative, in your timeline, that this is the piece of the project that we can reasonably accomplish in the timeline that we have for this grant.
Okay.
So if you think about it that way, like, I don't know if you have a, you know, work plan, if you can break it out as like in the next, you know, year, this is what we can do, that might help you shape the narrative for your.
Yeah, and we've got that kind of timeline, so I just
Perfect.
want to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that project sounds amazing, Anne. I would love to see I mean, you guys just always knock me off my feet whenever you guys tell me about what you're working on. It gives me chills. So thank you for sharing that. It's actually bringing tears to my eyes. You guys can't see it because I have my glasses on and I painted my face today. But thank you so much. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email telling the full story. Camille dropped it in the chat, or someone dropped it in the chat, but thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Reagan, are you able to take yourself off mute and ask your question? Okay. Reagan's question was, can two sub institutions under a larger one each apply? For example, could both a library and humanities department of a university apply together?
Yes, they could, either jointly or separately. And two departments from a university could also receive a grant, but they'd have to have separate DUNS numbers for their program, because the NEH will only award one grant per DUNS number. And if you don't know what a DUNS number is, welcome to the club. No, I do know now, but it's a unique identifier that each applicant will have to receive. Takes about two business days to get, is my understanding. So if you don't have one, you know, we give information on our guidelines on how you can obtain one, and you should be able to get one relatively quickly. But I'm assuming that most folks on here do have one.
Okay, thank you. Keith, can you take yourself off mute so you can ask your question, please?
I don't remember the question.
This one is about selection committee.
Yeah, could you tell me more about the selection process? And also, I just wanted to say, if you go through a university, you might have to go through their Office of Advancement, because that's usually how they stop applications from moving, or how they control applications. So if there are two departments, they may need to go through the Office of Advancement, and they may not grant you to DUNS. Anyway, could you tell us more about the selection process, the criteria, whether you need, if you have somebody in mind, do you need a full commitment application from that person, or with a resume, and do you need attachments? Just could you tell us what involved in that process?
Sure. So we are recruiting a selection committee now. We are on our grant guidelines page, there is a section that is the criteria is listed under which each application will be judged by the selection committee. They will be provided guidance that will largely mirror what's listed on our guidelines page for what they should be looking for in an application. The application was crafted in a way so that each of those questions specifically speaks to something that the selection committee will be looking at when determining the stronger applicants. So when we ask a question like, how was your organization impacted by the pandemic? Please demonstrate adverse impacts to your organization. We're asking that question because it's something the NEH is interested in. So we're making sure that our review committee is looking at that and judging it as one of the criteria. So they will be asked to use numerical rankings for a series of criteria points for each application. And then the committee will come together after doing an initial ranking and will look at the applicants as a whole and will, the numeric selection that the numeric scores they give will be the guiding document that will help them talk through a final slate of grantees that will look to have a range of project type, a geographic range, a range of underserved communities, underrepresented communities represented in the final slate of grantees. So we don't want all projects from the Northeast that deal with African American history, because that would not be a very representative group of grantees for a program aimed at telling the full history. So it's going to be both a numeric and then in-person discussion-based process. And we plan to draw from a range of backgrounds in selecting in inviting the selection committee. We want folks who are experienced in this work. We want folks who come from different backgrounds, different fields, different points in their careers, who will bring different perspectives to this. So we're not just asking 25 preservationists who have been in the field for 50 years. We really want we want the selection committee to be representative of the type of grantee slate that we hope to see.
And will you have a PDF with all the questions on the application? Can you download the questions of the application and prepare them separately and cut and paste into the document itself?
You could, so the application, it's an online application form. Once you access the application, there is a shortcut link to see and to download a PDF that has all those questions. We're also working to try to get that PDF posted on our site as a standalone document, so you don't even have to go in the system. I don't think that's up yet, but I'll double check on that. And you can also, the system saves your answers, so you can go in there, you can start an application, you can come back to it a few days later, your information will all still be there. The system also allows you to collaborate with people. So if you have 3 or 4 people on your team that are going to be working on the application, you can invite them to go into the application form, see what you've worked on, edit things, so you can collaboratively draft things. And again, we are happy to help guide you specifically through that process if it's something you want to do.
And how much organizational history do you require? Do you require annual budgets?
Keith, I'm so sorry. We're about to be on time. Keith, would you mind emailing Nikki and Leslie your questions, because we have a couple other questions in the chat that we need to get to.
Yeah, and if you send us an email, I have that PDF that I can email you that has the questions, so you can see what kind of information we're asking if it's not posted on our site yet.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you so much. Angelita, are you in a position to take yourself off mute and ask your question?
Yes, I just have a quick question. Thank you. Thank you. Would a documentary video about the historic place research? The research has been done, the place is on the National Register and so on. And we want to reach out more to the rural, non-academic community. So we want to do a documentary, and we want to supplement that with an archaeological topical survey. The documentary would highlight the next steps that we're doing for historic preservation within the community.
So the documentary, well, I would say that documentaries are eligible if they are focused on the underrepresented community.
Yes, yes. In other words, the documentary is about the historic site, the people at the site, the research that was done in order to qualify for the National Register. So it's not just the place, but the community. And what we're trying to do is engage the community with this project. And it's not, it's a rural community. And so we feel that a short video would be very engaging as opposed to doing programs with Zoom, because we're in a digital divide, and people would use their cell phones and they would not get the most out of a Zoom program. There's some hesitancy.
No, I think it would be eligible based on what I'm hearing. Do you have any thoughts,
Yes.
Nick?
I'm sorry?
No, yeah, the only thought I would add is that we sometimes have trouble reaching rural communities and seeing them represented in our grant programs. So that aspect of the project is appealing to me.
Okay, thank you. And just very quickly, I did put in the chat, there's an organization called the Pomeroy Foundation, and they have fantastic funds to help people pay for their markers and their plaques after they get on the national registers and so on.
Great.
Thank you,
Thank
Angela.
you. Thank you.
No problem. There is one last question, and Cheryl asked this, so I'm trying to interpret this the best way I can. But can you guys expound a little bit more on the criteria that a site that may have been impacted by the pandemic, exactly how? Is it loss of staff or something of that nature?
Sure, yeah. It can be, we're trying to fairly broadly define it. It could be loss of staff. It could be a drop in visitorship. Perhaps you had to close for a while and that impacted your revenue, or impacted your ability to provide services to your constituencies in some way. I imagine that all of us were in some way impacted by the pandemic, and it doesn't have to be a purely financial loss calculation. It just you have to make the case that in some way your organization was negatively impacted by the pandemic. And certainly for museums, if you had to close, I think that that's a pretty straightforward argument that you could make.
Okay. Oh, I'm glad I asked your question correctly, Cheryl.
I hope I answered it sufficiently.
Yes, and if you didn't, she'll email you directly.
Okay.
And copy me, and also do smoke signals and message in a bottle. I'm so thankful. Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions before we wrap up? None? I am so thankful to each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be. Relocation of a museum is a question that just came up. No?
Are you asking if that's eligible for?
Are you asking if, yeah, are you asking if it's eligible, Williams? Is it L. Williams? Can you take
Or
yourself?
is that a pandemic related piece? Relocation costs? No. I don't.
Well, in terms of, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just in terms of, so storage, because of not just the pandemic, but also the storm, Hurricane Ida also impacted
Gotcha.
people in New Orleans. And so this particular museum lost the space completely and had to place all of their holdings into storage. And so the project is going to entail creating a catalog of everything, refurbishing of materials, preservation, and that does inherently require some training, and it's a community engaged effort as well.
Sure. Yeah, there may be potential there. So it might, but I think that we probably would have to have a little bit more of a deeper discussion about it. So if you don't mind shooting us an email to that email that was in the chat box there, telling the full history at savingplaces.org, we'll be happy to see if there's some possibility there.
Okay, great. Thanks.
That's an amazing question. When the hurricanes came through, we were very somber in our office because we tend to want to help everyone and we just cannot. So please bombard Nikki and Leslie about maybe if this particular grant program doesn't work for what your scope is, ask them maybe if there's other things within the trust that can help you get back on your feet from the devastation of the hurricanes or any natural disaster.
Yes, because this is just one of several funding programs we have, so there may be a different fit. Yep. Thank you for mentioning that, Vidette. Very helpful.
You're welcome. I don't know all of them by heart yet, but I'm getting there. I am getting there. I like to just first, Nikki and Leslie, thank you so much for your time. And I just some background for all of you. Nikki and Leslie said that they had a grant program, and hey, by the way, Vidette, our deadline is the 15th. I said, I got to get you in front of members like immediately because you have all this money. It can't go back to the NEH. So I'm depending on you guys to show and prove, and please get in all of your multiple applications from AAAM to the team over at NEH. I really thank each and every one of you for your time. There's some folks who are really quiet who normally are not. I am not going to call any names, Vicky and George, but thank you guys so much for being here today with us. And I will, if you need us, you have our information, info@blackmuseums.org. And please have a wonderful weekend. And if I do not speak to you before the holiday, please enjoy your holiday. This has been a crazy 2 years for us. I look forward to seeing everybody in Miami next year. I know Omar is waiting for it. Terrence is waiting for us to come down, and Vicky in Sarasota is only 2 steps and a hop away from where we're going to be. At least in my mind, Vicky, I don't know how far you are from Miami, but to me, you're right in Terrence's backyard.
That's right. I plan to be there.
But I'm so thankful for each and every one of you. Thank you for being part of AAAM and just giving us life. And I hope that we breathe life into you as well. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Love you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. This will be recorded and emailed to everyone as well as the slide deck. So you'll get that very soon. Okay.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.